The ocean doesn't look black at night. It looks endless, like it forgot where the sky ends. Somewhere out there, the ship moves through anyway. Inside, the air feels different now. Heavier. Not from humidity, from waiting. A medical alarm cuts through the corridor intercom. Sharp, repeating, too calm to be comforting. Medical response team to deck 7. Repeat. Medical response team to deck 7. But no one moves. Because people stopped moving hours ago. Cabin doors are shut. Not locked. Just obeyed. You hear it through the walls first. Muffled footsteps in the hall. Then silence. Then another door clicking shut somewhere down the corridor, like a decision being made without you. Outside the window, the sea doesn't care. It never does. And somewhere between the hum of the engines and the flicker of the hallway lights, a rumor starts to spread faster than anything else on board. They're not moving people for treatment anymore. They're moving them for containment. A voice, someone you never actually see, whispers from behind a cracked door. They said it's just a precaution. Another voice answers, quieter. Then why did they seal deck 7? A pause. The ship tilts slightly. Not enough for panic, just enough for awareness. And that's when it lands. The thought no one wants to say out loud. When you're 200 miles from land, containment doesn't mean safety. It means delay. And somewhere deeper in the ship, another alarm begins to pulse. But this one isn't on the speakers. It's coming from inside the system itself. Cruise ships are often sold as escape, floating vacations where time slows down and the world feels distant. There's another way to think about them that rarely makes it into the brochures. A cruise ship is not just a holiday. It's a sealed city. Thousands of people, shared air, shared food systems, shared plumbing, limited medical facilities, and no immediate exit once you're underway. What looks like freedom from land is structurally a kind of controlled enclosure once you're out at sea. In environments like that, biology doesn't behave politely. Illness doesn't need much space. It doesn't need permission. It needs proximity. One person touching a railing. One tray passed at a buffet. One cough in an elevator. And suddenly, the ship becomes an accelerated version of everywhere we usually live, just compressed and intensified. That's why outbreaks on ships have always carried a particular kind of fear. Not just because people get sick, but because they realize how quickly normal routines can turn into containment procedures, quarantine protocols, cabin restrictions, closed deck measures that feel distant in theory until they're applied door to door in real time. And that's where something else enters the picture. Uncertainty. Because in these situations, information spreads almost as fast as illness. Rumors fill the gaps before official updates arrive. They said it's mild. They're isolating that floor. They're not telling us everything. Sometimes those statements are accurate. Sometimes they're distorted. But most of the time, passengers are left trying to separate reassurance from reality, while still inside the system itself. So this episode isn't just about one event or one outbreak. It's about what happens when a modern city is built on water, cut off from immediate escape, and forced to manage crisis in real time, while the people inside are still expected to vacation through it. Because once you understand how a cruise ship actually functions under stress, the line between normal operations and containment procedures starts to blur fast. And that's where the real tension begins. Before anything else, it's important to be precise about what we're actually talking about when the word hantavirus comes up, because it carries a kind of internet myth weight that doesn't always match how it behaves in the real world. Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome is not spread person to person in the way influenza or norovirus is. It's primarily transmitted from animals to humans, most commonly through exposure to infected rodent droppings, urine, or saliva. The risk comes when the materials dry out and become aerosolized. Disturbed dust particles can carry viral materials into the air, where it's then inhaled. That detail matters because it means infection isn't about casual proximity to other people. It's about specific environmental conditions. Enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces where rodents infestations exist and cleaning or movement stirs contaminated dust are the typical risk scenarios. This is why outbreaks are rare, but when they do occur, they tend to be geographically and environmentally specific. And severity is part of what makes hantavirus so psychologically heavy. It is uncommon, but when it progresses to severe disease, it can escalate quickly into respiratory failure. That combination, rare but serious, creates a disproportionate sense of fear whenever it enters public discussion. Now here's the key correction for our setting. Cruise ships are not classic hantavirus environments. Modern crew vessels are heavily controlled for pest management, sanitation, and air handling. You don't typically have the kind of rodent exposure conditions associated with natural outbreaks. So in a strict epidemiological sense, hantavirus is not likely a driver of shipboard illness scenarios. But that's where perception and systems begin to diverge. Because even when a specific disease doesn't apply, the idea of a closed environment does. A cruise ship functions as a dense, self-contained ecosystem. Enclosed systems behave differently under stress, not because every pathogen is present, but because transmission pathways become amplified when people share space, air, and surfaces continuously. That's why ships are more commonly associated with other types of outbreaks, especially respiratory and gastrointestinal ones. Viruses like norovirus or influenza don't require environmental reservoirs like rodents. They require people. And ships have no shortage of people. In those cases, transmission is simple. Shared surfaces, handrails, dining areas, restrooms, elevators, airborne droplets in close quarters. One infected person boarding at the start of a voyage can, under the right conditions, seed multiple transmission chains before anyone even realizes what's happening. And unlike a city on land, there's no natural escape valve. No one disperses to different homes at night. No one leaves the building and resets the contact network. The contact network is the ship. That's what makes closed systems feel different under outbreak pressure. Not because every illness is more dangerous, but because every interaction is more connected. And once cases begin to appear, the psychology shifts just as fast as the biology. People start interpreting normal ship behavior, closing doors, staff movement, and restricted access, as signs of escalation. Even routine sanitation measures can begin to look like emergency response when viewed through uncertainty. So even if a disease like hantavirus isn't part of the equation, the framework of fear it represents still echoes in these environments. Rare, severe, hard to see coming, and associated with enclosed spaces. That's where the conversation naturally shifts. Because the real story on ships usually isn't about a single exotic pathogen. It's about how quickly ordinary illness becomes amplified when a system is built to keep people together, not apart. If we move from theory into what actually happens on board cruise ships, the picture becomes less about rare edge case diseases and more about something much more familiar and much more repeatable. The most common culprit in shipboard outbreaks is not something exotic. It's norovirus. Norovirus is infamous for one reason. It spreads fast. Extremely fast. It requires very few viral particles to infect someone, and it moves easily through contaminated hands, surfaces, food handling, and shared spaces. In environments where thousands of people eat, touch the same rails, press the same elevator buttons, and use the same facilities within a tightly compressed timeline, it doesn't need much advantage to establish itself. Cruise ships, by design, are high-contact environments. Even with modern sanitation protocols, there are unavoidable realities. Buffets with shared serving utensils, crowded dining rooms, entertainment venues, and constant movement through shared corridors. One of those spaces becomes a potential transmission node if an outbreak begins. And unlike a city on land, response happens inside the same enclosed system where the spread is occurring. That's where containment procedures begin. When cases appear on board, cruise lines typically escalate hygiene protocols quickly. Intensified cleaning schedules, closure or modification of buffet-style service, increased hand sanitation stations, and in some cases, restriction of movement or isolation of affected passengers and crew. Cabin confinement may be implemented for systematic individuals, and certain decks or zones may be limited depending on severity or spread patterns. From a logistical standpoint, these measures are designed to break transmission chains. From a human standpoint, they change the entire experience of being on a ship almost instantly. A vacation becomes procedural. Hallways feel different when you're not supposed to linger in them. Dining becomes structured instead of social. Even announcements over the intercom begin to carry a different emotional weight, because now they're no longer just information. They are instructions inside a closed environment you cannot exit. One of the most difficult aspects of onboard outbreaks is that isolation doesn't look like isolation from the outside. It looks like doors. Closed doors. Stay in room directives. food delivered outside cabins, limited interactions with crew who are now operating under protective protocols themselves. And psychologically, that creates a very specific kind of pressure, because you are still surrounded by thousands of people, but separated from them in layers of procedure and restriction. You can hear activity in the hallways without participating in it. You can see the ocean outside your window without being able to reach land any faster. An uncertainty fills the gaps between updates. Even when the situation is being managed effectively, the lack of full visibility inside the system leads to speculation. People begin tracking symptoms, comparing notes, interpreting small changes in routine as signals of escalation. It is not just the illness that spreads in these environments. It is interpretation. Fear becomes part of the ship's internal ecosystem, passed through conversation, through silence, through observation of what is no longer happening. And in that state, time itself feels different. Days lose structure. Movement becomes restricted. Normal travel expectations dissolve into wanting for the next announcement, the next update, the next permission to move freely again. Because on land, you can leave. At sea, you wait for permission to feel safe again. When people talk about cruise ships in general, they often collapse every brand and vessel into a single idea. One floating system, one set of risks, one shared reality. But in practice, there are major differences in how these environments are built and managed. Take Disney Cruise Line, for example. This is one of the most tightly controlled cruise environments in the industry, designed from the ground up around families and structured guest experience. From sanitation protocols to food handling systems to onboard guest flow, everything is engineered in a high level of procedural consistency. Sanitation standards are rigorous and highly visible. Hand washing stations are not optional. They're built into movement patterns across dining areas. Cleaning cycles are frequent and standardized. Crew training emphasizes prevention as much as response. Even the layout of spaces reflects a controlled approach to crowd density and interaction, with an emphasis on predictable movement and supervised environments. In that sense, ships like this are not casual floating hotels. They are highly managed ecosystems where risk mitigation is built into daily operations. And yet, even in environments with strong controls, public perception rarely tracks the technical reality in real time. Because the moment a health-related incident appears in any cruise context, it enters a completely different system, the information ecosystem. This is where social media begins to reshape the narrative faster than official reporting can stabilize it. A single post can travel faster than verified updates. A short video clip out of context can imply escalation. A passenger's isolated experience can be interpreted as systematic failure. And once those pieces circulate, they begin to merge into a larger impression that may not reflect the actual scope or severity of the situation on board. This is not unique to cruise travel. It's a pattern seen across many high-density, high-visibility environments, But cruise ships amplify it because one key factor: people cannot immediately leave to verify conditions themselves. They are reliant on indirect information while still physically inside the system being discussed. That gap between experience and interpretation is where misinformation tends to grow. Not always intentionally, often through repetition, assumption, or emotional framing. A routine sanitation response becomes lockdown. A precautionary isolation becomes quarantine of entire decks. A small cluster of illness becomes generalized fear about the entire vessel. And because cruise travel is already associated with confinement and movement at sea, those narratives feel plausible even when they are incomplete. So the result is a split perception. On one side, operational reality, structured protocols, sanitation systems, confinement procedures designed to prevent escalation. On the other side, public interpretation, rapid, emotional, and shaped by fragmented information shared in real time. And neither side fully cancels the other out. They exist simultaneously, layered over the same events. Which is why cruise-related health scares often feel larger in public memory than other clinical or operational scope might suggest. Not because nothing is happening, but because information moves faster than confirmation, and fear moves faster than both. When you strip everything back, cruise ships aren't defined by any single outbreak, rumor, or headline. They sit at the intersection of three forces that constantly interact with each other. The first is real disease risk. In any dense human environment, illness is always a possibility. Not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily rare in the way people imagine, but structurally present wherever large groups share air, surfaces, and food systems. That's just biology operating at scale. The second is human psychology. On a ship, everything is close enough to notice. Every update is immediate. Every change in routine is visible. That proximity turns abstract probabilities into lived awareness. Even small disruptions feel larger because there's nowhere for them to spread out and disappear into the background of a city. And the third is information distortion. In modern environments, perception doesn't come from what is happening. It comes from how quickly it is reported, interpreted, and reshaped as it moves. Official updates, passenger accounts, and social media posts all enter the same space, even without clear separation. By the time information reaches most people, it has already been filtered through emotion, repetition, and context lost. So what you end up with is not a single narrative, but overlapping versions of reality competing for attention inside the same confined space. None of this requires conspiracy to feel unsettling. It's just the natural outcome of density, distance from land, and constant communication loops. Because at sea, everything is amplified slightly, not in magnitude, but in visibility. You notice more, you hear more, you wait more, and in that waiting, your mind starts connecting patterns that might not actually belong together. which brings everything back to the simplest truth in this environment. The ocean doesn't create the danger, it just makes it impossible to ignore. Before we go, if you've ever been on a cruise, good, bad, or somewhere in between, I want to hear it. Maybe it was the best vacation you've ever taken. Maybe it was something you still think about because of how strange, stressful, or unforgettable it felt at sea. Send in your stories, your experiences, or anything you witnessed on board. You can submit your stories to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls at gmail.com. Again, that's Hexes, Haunts, and Howls, all one word, at gmail.com. And as always, all stories will remain anonymous. Thank you for listening to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Until next time, stay sweet.